I've read that your experience really revolves around the intersection of education and the law, so I'm curious, what is your favorite Supreme Court decision related to education and why, and what is your least favorite Supreme Court decision related to education and why?
That's a great question. So perhaps not surprisingly, and I'm not alone in this, my favorite education-related case is Brown versus Board of Education. I think it was a high watermark of the Warren Court and in some respects a high watermark of the Supreme Court in the 20th century. I think the court in that case corrected the error that it made in Plessy versus Ferguson, where it upheld the principle of separate but equal as consistent with the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution, and declared that segregation in schools was inherently unequal and therefore unconstitutional. And I think that was an absolutely correct decision on the law, and I think it was a correct decision both morally and historically. The decision I like the least is Milliken versus Bradley, which was decided on the 20th anniversary of Brown versus Board of Education and in some respects represented the low water mark of school desegregation. Milliken is not nearly as well known as Brown versus Board of Education, but in some respects it has more of a lasting influence today on the structure of education than Brown versus Board of Education. What the court decided there was that school desegregation could not extend beyond school boundaries unless there was proof that the boundary lines were somehow gerrymandered to promote segregation between the districts, or that one district had basically colluded with another. The reason this was so important is that by the 1970s, and this is still true today, although less so, by the 1970s, schools had become majority-minority school districts, and the surrounding suburban schools were mostly white. If school desegregation were limited just to single districts in urban areas, you would be busing mostly minority kids from majority-minority schools in one part of the city to majority-minority schools in another. It also had impacts in terms of socioeconomics, because those who fled the cities to avoid desegregation or for other reasons were families who had the resources to leave. And so oftentimes, and it's also true today, city schools were predominantly poor. And by limiting the remedy of desegregation to urban areas, that meant that there was a wall created between urban school systems and suburban school systems. And I think the impact of that decision is still felt today. I often tell my students, if you want to know why urban and suburban schools look the way they do today, you need to understand Milliken versus Bradley. There was an opportunity there to cross district lines to create meaningful integration throughout a metropolitan area that the court turned away from. And I think in some ways we're still living with the impact of that decision.